Back in July, we made a video on the upcoming MacBook Air redesign with Apple's brand new M2 chip. And since that video, we not only got new information, but Apple has also released the 5th generation of MacBook Pros, which gives us a really good insight into what features the new MacBook Air might come with. And I want to start off with some design updates. We all know that the new MacBook Air would be the biggest design change that the Air line has ever received. Apple's making it flat, just like the MacBook Pro, so no more wedge shape. They're adding colors like the new iMacs, and on top of that, they're making the bezel and the keyboard fully white. But after these new MacBook Pros got released, and we saw Apple very unexpectedly adding a notch, the biggest question now is, will the Air also come with a notch? Leaker Dylan DKT published a bunch of new info on this upcoming MacBook Air, which I'm going to cover in just a second, but in that info, he hasn't said anything about the Air having a notch. However, John Prosser, who was the first to report on this big MacBook Air redesign, he updated his concept recently to add a notch in. Now, John said that he updated his concept after validating his info with Leaker Dylan DKT, which means that the chance of Apple adding a notch to the MacBook Air is quite high now. So what's my personal take on this? Well, if we take a look at the new MacBook Pros, the main reason why Apple added a notch was to make the bezels super thin. The notch doesn't really serve any other functionality. So then the question becomes, will Apple also make the bezels on the new MacBook Air this thin and then add a notch as a result? Well, I do actually see this being very likely. And that's because if you take a look at the latest MacBook Air redesign released in 2018, it actually had the exact same bezel size as the MacBook Pro that was sold at that time. So yes, I do see Apple adding a notch to the MacBook Air as well in order to keep this design consistent to the MacBook Pros and further push this unique notch aesthetic, just like they've done it with the iPhone. So what about features? We didn't really know anything about them back in July, but now we actually have a really good idea of what the MacBook Air might come with a lot of the features being borrowed from the new MacBook Pros. The first one being MagSafe. Not much to say about this, as this was quite expected, but does this actually mean that we will also get fast charging like with the new MacBook Pros? Well, according to leaker Dylan DKT, the new MacBook Air would come with a 30-watt power adapter. The power adapter that comes with the current MacBook Air is also a 30-watt power adapter, so no fast charging, unfortunately. But I personally don't think that this would be a problem, as the battery life on this new Air would simply be insane. More about the battery life soon. The second new feature is support for more external displays, which has also been confirmed by Dylan DKT. Now, this is pretty much a no-brainer. The new MacBook Air will come with Apple's M2 chip, which would indeed support more than one external display, a limitation that the M1 models had. And I think that's great, because at the moment, people who want to use 2 external displays have no choice other than buying an older Intel model from eBay or going for the much more expensive 14-inch MacBook Pro. And you honestly don't know how much of a productivity boost having a second monitor gets you until you use one. Everyone watching this video should get a second monitor. I've left a link in the description to my favorite one that I'm using both at home, at work, and I also got 3 more of the same monitor for my team. So check it out, not sponsored, but it's a really, really good one. Now, a very weird thing that Dylan DKT mentioned is that the new MacBook Air would have USB-C ports. Obviously, USB-C is nothing new, but the lack of Thunderbolt is. Now, I'm not sure if he simply just admitted, saying that these are also Thunderbolt 4 ports, or if Apple will actually remove Thunderbolt functionality from this new MacBook Air, but the reality is that most people don't need Thunderbolt. Sure, it is awesome, as you can connect crazy 6K and 8K displays, as well as transfer data at blistering speeds of up to 40 gigabits per second, but unless you're a pro user, I just don't think you'll ever need it. And on top of this, Thunderbolt is a technology that was developed by Apple and Intel. However, Intel owns all the royalty and licensing rights to it. So what I'm saying is that Intel MacBook Pros and Intel MacBooks in the past had Thunderbolt support by default. But after Apple's transition to their own chips, Macs didn't lose Thunderbolt, but instead Apple worked with Intel to add a custom Thunderbolt controller, which allowed the new MacBook Pros, for example, to have Thunderbolt 4. But all of this costs extra in licensing. And especially if Thunderbolt is such a pro port, there is zero reason for Apple to add it to this new MacBook Air, which is going to be the entry-level MacBook. Not only that, but USB 4 has recently been released, which has all the benefits of Thunderbolt 3, but without the licensing costs. Apple could easily add USB 4 and still allow for things such as dual 4K monitors and 40 gigabit per second transfer speeds, but without the Thunderbolt naming scheme, which is what I really think is going to happen here. And if it doesn't, then it definitely should. Okay, now if you have a Mac, you need to try out Setapp, our sponsor for this video. Setapp is something that I use every day, and I am a paying customer myself. So let me show you why I love it so much. You just launch it and you search for a task. So let's just say that I want to control my external displays, and Setapp has already found an app called Display Buddy, which I can install with just one click. And now I can adjust the brightness and the contrast of my external monitors, something that almost no monitor supports natively in macOS. This is honestly a life changer for me. Setapp also has curated collections, including our very own ZONEofTECH work pack, which includes the 8 apps that I use the most. With over 220 apps that can solve almost any task that you can think of, Setapp is something that you definitely gotta try. And you can try it for free for the first 7 days by using the link below. And now, back to the video. Oh, and we finally have an update on the webcam, which according to leaker Dylan DKT, will also be upgraded to a 1080p sensor, just like on the new MacBook Pros. Now, I don't know if it's just me, but I'm not actually a big fan of this new camera on the new MacBook Pros. I mean, sure, the footage is almost entirely noise-free, but that's not just because of the new sensor, it's mostly thanks to a ton of noise reduction being applied in post, which always ends up making my face look off, like someone sharpened it and then smoothed it right after. I don't know, it just looks weird to me. And just like my theory on the bezel sizes, I do think that it does make a lot of sense for Apple to also match the quality of the front-facing camera to what they have on the MacBook Pros, just like they've done with the previous generations. I also have an interesting update on the naming scheme. So Dylan claims that Apple is considering just calling it MacBook, which I think Apple should 100% do. You see, because of the iPad Air, the Air name doesn't make any sense now. The Air branding originally symbolized the thinnest version of the MacBook. Then the 12-inch MacBook launched, which was actually thinner than the Air, so the Air name simply meant that it was now the most affordable option. And then the new iPad Air launched, which was more expensive than the entry-level iPad, but also thicker than the iPad Pro, so it was no longer the cheapest or the thinnest. And just like how with the iPhones we have iPhone and iPhone Pro, Apple should do the same with the MacBooks, so that we have MacBook, this new MacBook Air, and then the MacBook Pros with the 14 and 16-inch models. Oh, and in our video on the new 2022 iPad lineup, I also talked about how it would make no sense for Apple to keep the MacBook Air around once the entry level gets updated to that same flat frame design. So I really think that the Air name is going to be phased out, something that Apple should have done ages ago. And now I also have some updates on the brand new M2 chip. So we already know that this new chip would be a follow-up to the M1 with the same number of CPU cores, 2 more GPU cores, and a lower power consumption thanks to the smaller 4nm manufacturing process. So the battery will see an improvement here. And same as last year, we are set to get a bin version of the M2 chip as well, one that would come with a 9-core GPU rather than 10, but for a slightly lower price. But that's nothing new. The big new update comes from Dylan DKT, who claims that the M2 MacBook Air would be released in mid-2022, which coincides with WWDC. That would be the perfect place for Apple to announce the M2 chip, as it would be exactly 2 years since Apple announced the switch to their own silicon. Over the M1, the M2 would be a decent upgrade. Of course, it won't be as powerful as the M1 Pro or the M1 Max inside the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, but that's fine, as that's not what this machine is supposed to be. The new MacBook Air would literally be the perfect MacBook, or to be honest, I would even go as far as calling this the perfect laptop for anyone who wants a machine that's good at everything, like great performance, great battery life, great display, great design, and also a pretty great price. Speaking of price, in his most recent Power Up newsletter, Mark Gurman said that Apple will also be updating the entry-level MacBook Pro, which is something that Mark also reported on a couple of months ago, that a 13-inch MacBook Pro would get updated with the M2 chip, and I think it would also very likely keep the same design. Like, Mark hasn't said anything about a redesign. So this is some awesome news, guys, as it means that the new MacBook Air could start at the same $999 price point while getting this all-new redesign. Then the 13-inch MacBook Pro would have thicker bezels, a worse front-facing camera, but longer battery life and more performance thanks to it having a cooling fan. And then the 14-inch Pro would offer things such as ProMotion, Mini LED, more ports, and significantly better performance thanks to the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips. I honestly find it so hard to believe that this new MacBook Air could start at just $999. But to be honest, even if it were to start at $1,100, for example, it would still be an outstanding deal, as this laptop would literally tick all the boxes that the majority of people want in a laptop. Would you guys go for an Air, or would you guys go for something like a MacBook Pro with more performance, but also a heavier and less portable form factor? Let me know in the comments. I'm Daniel, this has been ZONEofTECH, and stay tuned for more Leaks and Rumors episodes. ZONEofTECH, signing out. Cheers.